The continent that learned to bend the rules. No nation is born innocent. Some are born desperate. Long before the United States learned to call itself a democracy, before it learned to speak the language of rights and liberty, it learned something far more practical and far more dangerous: how to survive by bending its own rules. The habit began quietly, so quietly that no one at the time recognized it as the first crack. In 1606, England was not dreaming of freedom, it was dreaming of money. The crown was weak, the treasury thinner than it appeared, and Europe was locked in an endless competition for land, resources, and prestige. Spain had grown rich on silver and conquest. France was expanding cautiously. England was late, and lateness breeds recklessness. So King James I signed a document that looked harmless, a charter granting the Virginia Company permission to establish a settlement across the Atlantic. It was framed as commerce, wrapped in legality, and sold to investors as opportunity. What it actually created was a distance between power and consequence. When authority is far away, enforcement becomes flexible. When enforcement becomes flexible, morality follows. The men who crossed the ocean. The ships that sailed for Virginia in December 1606 did not carry saints or visionaries. They carried men who had failed somewhere else. There were gentlemen with no fortunes, laborers with no futures, soldiers with no wars left to fight. Many had criminal records quietly erased in exchange for obedience. Most were unprepared for agriculture. Almost none understood the land they were going to occupy. Among them was Thomas Hale, 28 years old, the son of a cooper, literate but unremarkable. His greatest skill was observation. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed who survived arguments and who disappeared after them. That skill would save his life. After 4 brutal months at sea, the ships entered the Chesapeake Bay and eventually settled on a swampy peninsula they named Jamestown, not because it was suitable, but because it was defensible. The water was brackish, the soil poor, the mosquitoes relentless. Within weeks, men were dying. The early leaders lied in their reports back to England, insisting progress was steady. Journals kept by common men told another story of ration thefts, violent punishments, and fear masquerading as discipline. From the beginning, authority in Jamestown was enforced, not respected. When law fails, power speaks. By the winter of 1609, Jamestown collapsed into what history would later call the starving time. Crops failed, supply ships did not arrive, people began eating dogs, rats, leather, and eventually the dead. One man was executed for murdering his wife to consume her body. Thomas Hale did not participate, he watched. He watched the governor suspend normal rules. He watched executions without trials. He watched men accept cruelty if it meant survival. And he learned the most important lesson America would learn over and over again. In emergencies, people will forgive almost anything if you promise safety. When relief ships finally arrived in 1610, Jamestown staggered back from the edge of extinction. But it was not the same place. Something had changed permanently. They had crossed a line and survived. Tobacco and the business of human beings. Jamestown was saved not by morality or reform, but by tobacco. John Rolfe's successful cultivation turned the colony into a profit machine almost overnight. Land became valuable. Labor became essential. Speed became everything. Indentured servants arrived first. poor Europeans trading years of labor for passage and the promise of land. Many died before their contracts ended. Their suffering was considered an acceptable loss. In 1619, another ship arrived. It carried Africans. At first, their legal status was ambiguous, but ambiguity is temporary. Systems prefer clarity. Within decades, laws hardened. Skin color became destiny. Freedom became inheritable. Enslavement became permanent. Thomas Hale never publicly questioned it. He told himself it was beyond him. His silence mattered. The next generation. Order over justice. Thomas's son, William Hale, was born into a colony that had learned to function. He inherited land, expectations, and an unspoken rule. Stability mattered more than fairness. William grew up watching native alliances made and broken as convenience demanded. Treaties signed in daylight were ignored by nightfall. Violence was justified as necessity. When Bacon's Rebellion erupted in 1776, it terrified colonial elites. Poor farmers, white and black, rose together against the ruling class, accusing it of corruption and neglect. For a brief moment, the illusion shattered. The rebellion was crushed brutally, and afterward, the ruling class responded not with reform, but with strategy. Laws were rewritten to divide people permanently. Race became the wall that prevented unity. William benefited. He never asked how. This was another pattern forming: crisis, fear, consolidation, silence. Stability, the most dangerous lie. By the early 1700s, the colonies felt normal. Churches stood, courts functioned, trade flourished. Violence became bureaucratic instead of chaotic. Jonathan Hale believed deeply in order. He read political philosophy and spoke eloquently about rights while owning enslaved people without doubt or discomfort. He believed tyranny came only from kings, not systems. That belief would not survive the century. Taxes, words, and the slow birth of rebellion. After costly imperial wars, Britain began taxing the colonies more aggressively. The amounts were manageable, the principle was not. Jonathan and men like him did not demand equality, they demanded consultation. They wanted a voice. Meetings were held, pamphlets circulated, rhetoric sharpened. The idea that resistance could be moral took root. What began as complaint evolved into identity. Jonathan died before the breaking point. His son, Samuel Hale, would live through it. Revolution. Not clean, not pure. The American Revolution was not a united uprising. It was fractured, violent, and personal. Neighbors informed on neighbors, loyalists fled or were punished. Revolutionary committees exercised unchecked authority. Newspapers were shut down, arrests were made without trial. Samuel Hale served the cause while watching its contradictions unfold. He justified them as temporary. Almost everyone did. When independence was won, the country faced a terrifying truth. Freedom had no operating manual. The government failed, the economy collapsed, armed rebellions broke out. Democracy frightened the men who had unleashed it. So they met in Philadelphia in secrecy and rewrote the rules. The Constitution was not written to unleash the people, it was written to contain them. By 1800, the United States existed as a nation, but also as a habit of expanding power during emergencies, justifying exceptions as temporary, and forgetting to reverse them. The Hale family survived every era not by leading history, but by adapting to it. They accepted compromises, avoided resistance, and benefited quietly. They were not unique. They were America, and now the nation would turn westward, toward land, conquest, displacement, and a contradiction so large that it would eventually tear the country in two. But not yet. First, it would pretend everything was under control.
Nations rarely announce when they become empires. They usually insist they are doing the opposite. By the early 19th century, the United States spoke the language of liberty fluently. It celebrated revolutions, warned against tyranny, and congratulated itself on having escaped the corruption of old empires. Yet, beneath the speeches and symbols, the country had already adopted the oldest imperial instinct of all: expand or be consumed. This instinct would shape everything that followed. A republic with an appetite. After independence, America inherited a continent it did not yet control, and a population it did not fully trust. The land beyond the Appalachians was vast, fertile, and already occupied by native nations with histories older than Europe's presence in the New World. To American leaders, this was not a moral problem, it was a logistical one. Thomas Jefferson spoke of liberty while imagining a nation of endless farmers spreading westward. He also authorized secret intelligence missions, quiet land grabs, and treaties designed to fail. Jefferson believed Native Americans could either assimilate or vanish. He preferred not to think about what would happen if they chose neither. The contradiction was not hidden, it was simply ignored. For families like the Hales, westward expansion offered opportunity without introspection. Land was cheap, risk was shared, responsibility was abstract. Samuel Hale's sons, Elias and Matthew, grew up believing westward movement was not conquest, but destiny. The Louisiana Purchase, a legal lie that saved the nation. In 1803, the United States doubled its size overnight. The Louisiana Purchase was celebrated as a diplomatic triumph. What was discussed less was its legality. Jefferson knew the Constitution did not clearly authorize the purchase. He worried briefly about precedent. Then he made a decision that would echo through American history. He did it anyway. Congress approved. The people celebrated. The Constitution survived. Unchanged, but quietly stretched. This moment mattered more than most battles. It taught the nation a lesson it would repeat endlessly. If the outcome is good, the method will be forgiven. Elias Hale moved west into Kentucky soon after. He never questioned whether the land was rightfully his. The treaty existed. That was enough. Native removal, when democracy voted for expulsion. As settlers pushed west, conflict became inevitable. Native nations resisted displacement. Violence escalated. American leaders framed the issue as unavoidable tragedy rather than deliberate policy. By the 1820s, the pressure reached a breaking point. Andrew Jackson did not invent native removal, he perfected it. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed legally, debated openly, and supported by voters. It authorized the forced relocation of entire nations. Courts objected. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of native sovereignty. Jackson ignored them. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it, he reportedly said. And no one did. The trail of tears followed. Marches, starvation, death. A policy executed not in secret, but in daylight. Democracy had spoken. Power had listened. Matthew Hale served briefly as a clerk for a territorial office during this period. He processed documents that transferred land titles. He never saw the marches. He saw only paperwork. That distance made everything easier. Slavery hardens into ideology. As the nation expanded, slavery did not merely persist, it adapted. What was once defended as economic necessity hardened into something colder, a fully articulated worldview. Laws tightened, surveillance increased, violence became ritualized. Slave patrols roamed the South. Fugitive slave acts compelled participation even in free states. Neutrality became illegal. Elias Hale, now a modest landowner, did not own slaves, but his prosperity depended on a system that did. He sold crops into markets built on enslaved labor. He voted for men who protected that structure. America was no longer asking whether slavery was right, it was asking whether it was permanent. The Missouri Compromise, delay as policy. In 1820, the question finally threatened to tear the nation apart. Would slavery expand westward? The answer was compromise, not resolution. The Missouri Compromise drew a line across the continent and pretended that a moral crisis could be solved with geometry. North and South agreed to pause the argument. Pauses feel like peace. They are not. For the next 30 years, the country accumulated unresolved tension. Every new state reopened the wound. Every debate grew sharper. The Hales, like many families, avoided extremes. They believed moderation was wisdom. History would punish that belief. The cult of manifest destiny. By the 1840s, America found a name for its hunger: manifest destiny. It sounded divine. It felt inevitable. It excused everything. War with Mexico followed, not framed as aggression, but as fulfillment. Land was seized, borders were redrawn. Slavery followed settlers like a shadow. Caleb Hale fought briefly in the Mexican-American War. He returned disturbed but silent. He had seen villages burned, civilians displaced, soldiers rewarded for brutality. No one asked him what he had seen. They asked what land he would claim. Compromise collapses. The Compromise of 1850 tried again to hold the nation together. Stronger fugitive slave laws enraged the North. New territories reignited old arguments. Violence erupted in Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery settlers murdered each other openly. This was not political disagreement anymore. It was rehearsal. Caleb Hale settled in Illinois. He opposed slavery personally, but feared disruption more. He believed the Union mattered above all else. So did many men. They would soon be forced to choose which mattered more. The election that broke the spell. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected without winning a single Southern state. The system had worked exactly as designed, and half the country rejected the result. Secession followed, not as chaos, but as procedure. Ordinances were written, flags were raised, armies formed. The illusion of shared reality collapsed. The Union did not dissolve overnight. It fractured, legally, morally, violently. Caleb Hale's youngest son, Nathan, was 17 when Fort Sumter fell. He would soon wear a uniform. He would soon learn what happens when compromises finally run out. The nation had delayed reckoning for generations. Now the bill had come due, and it would be paid in blood. When the Republic stopped asking permission. The American Civil War did not begin with cannon fire. It began with a question the nation had avoided for 80 years. What happens when a democracy loses the consent of half its people? No constitution had prepared for that. 2 countries, 1 name. By the spring of 1861, the United States existed in theory but not in practice. 11 states had declared secession. They wrote a constitution of their own, one that openly protected slavery. They claimed legality, heritage, and self-defense. The Union claimed something different: permanence. Nathan Hale enlisted in the Union Army, believing the war would be short. Almost everyone did. Politicians promised resolution. Newspapers predicted glory. They were all wrong. Emergency as a way of life. Within weeks, Lincoln made decisions no president had made before. He suspended habeas corpus, the right to challenge unlawful detention, without congressional approval. Thousands were arrested without trial: suspected spies, Confederate sympathizers, journalists, and political opponents. Courts objected. A sitting Chief Justice declared Lincoln's actions unconstitutional.
Lincoln ignored him. He justified it with a single sentence that would echo through history. "Must I let the government fall so that one law be preserved?" Congress eventually retroactively approved his actions. That mattered too, because it taught the nation a lesson more powerful than any battlefield victory. If survival is at stake, legality can be negotiated after the fact. Nathan Hale saw the cost firsthand. He marched through states that no longer recognized federal authority. He watched towns emptied, farms burned, railroads destroyed. War was no longer a clash of armies, it was a dismantling of societies. Total war and the death of illusion. As the war dragged on, restraint collapsed. General Sherman's march through the South made destruction a strategy. Civilians were no longer spectators, they were targets of pressure. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was calculation. The Union would win by breaking the South's will to continue. Nathan participated in raids that would have horrified his grandfather. He justified them the same way the nation did. There was no other way. By 1865, more Americans were dead than in all other U.S. wars combined. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was shattered. Slavery was dead, but not buried. Victory without clarity. The war ended, Lincoln was assassinated, and the nation faced a second, quieter crisis: what to do with peace. Reconstruction began with ambition and collapsed under fear. For a brief moment, America tried something radical. Enslaved people were freed. Constitutional amendments promised equality. Federal troops enforced civil rights in the South. It was the most democratic moment in American history, and it terrified many Americans. White resistance formed immediately through laws, violence, and terror organizations. The federal government hesitated, compromised, withdrew. Reconstruction ended not with defeat, but with exhaustion. Nathan Hale returned home to a country technically reunited and practically divided. He watched new systems of control replace the old ones. Segregation hardened. Voting rights were stripped away quietly. The Constitution remained intact. Its promises were selectively enforced. The industrial turn. Power without faces. By the late 19th century, America found a new engine of control. Railroads crossed the continent. Corporations grew larger than governments. Wealth concentrated at unprecedented levels. Workers organized. Strikes erupted. The government did not remain neutral. Federal troops were deployed against labor movements. Courts sided with corporations. Violence was justified as protection of order. Once again, emergency language returned, this time against workers. Nathan's son, Edward Hale, worked briefly in a steel town. He watched private guards shoot striking men. He learned that freedom of speech ended where profit began. This was not a betrayal of American values, it was a continuation. War abroad, Kroll at home. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain. It claimed liberation as motive. It acquired colonies instead. The Philippines resisted American rule. The U.S. responded with camps, torture, and counterinsurgency tactics learned from European empires it claimed to despise. At home, the public cheered. Edward Hale noticed something subtle. Americans accepted brutality more easily when it happened far away. That habit would return. World War I and the criminalization of dissent. When World War I erupted, America joined late but decisively and immediately turned inward. The Espionage Act and Sedition Act criminalized criticism of the government. Newspapers were shut down, protesters imprisoned, socialists deported. The Supreme Court upheld it all. Clear and present danger, they said. Edward Hale's brother was arrested for distributing anti-war pamphlets. He was released months later, broken and silent. War ended, the laws stayed. Fear as a political resource. The post-war years brought panic. The Red Scare swept the country. Immigrants were raided. Due process vanished. Deportations applauded. Emergency became routine. Edward Hale grew old watching the pattern repeat itself. Crisis, fear, expanded power, normalization. The Great Depression followed, then another world war. Each emergency justified new authority. Each authority lingered. The nation that survived by transforming. By the mid-20th century, the United States had become something unrecognizable to its founders, and yet perfectly aligned with its habits. It was a global power. It was a security state. It was a democracy that routinely suspended itself. The Hale family survived every transformation by doing what millions of Americans did. They adapted. They stayed quiet when silence was rewarded. They spoke when speaking was safe. They told themselves it was temporary. It never was. The story is not over, because the Cold War would take these instincts and institutionalize them permanently. Surveillance, secrecy, loyalty tests, and a government that no longer needed emergencies to justify control. It would call it national security, and almost everyone would agree.
After the Second World War, America stood taller than it ever had before. Its cities were intact, its factories were running, its enemies were defeated. And yet, this was the moment fear truly began. Because the next enemy did not arrive with tanks or uniforms. It arrived as an idea. Communism had no face, no border, no clear battlefield. And when an enemy can be anywhere, suspicion becomes policy. The Cold War transformed fear into routine. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it had to be proven. Teachers signed oaths. Government workers were investigated. Artists were questioned. Careers disappeared overnight, not because of crimes, but because of associations. Accusation replaced evidence. Silence replaced defense. Joseph McCarthy did not create this system. He revealed how easily it could be used. With a microphone and a list no one was allowed to see, he demonstrated something America would never forget. You do not need proof to destroy a life. You only need doubt. Behind the scenes, the machinery expanded. Files were opened. Phones were tapped. Organizations were mapped, not for violence, but for belief. The government insisted this was protection, and most Americans agreed, because the fear felt real, and fear makes compromises feel reasonable. At the same time, another truth refused to stay hidden. Black Americans had fought fascism overseas, then returned home to segregation, intimidation, and violence. The Constitution promised equality. Reality denied it daily. The civil rights movement forced the country to watch itself. Peaceful marches met batons, children met fire hoses, voices met prison cells. The world saw it. America saw it. And the state responded in a familiar way, not only with laws, but with surveillance. Civil rights leaders were monitored as threats. Phones were tapped. Meetings were infiltrated. Martin Luther King Jr. was treated not as a moral leader, but as a destabilizing force. Progress was allowed. Control was mandatory. Change could happen, but only under observation. Then, Vietnam shattered the remaining illusions. The war was justified with confident language and secret calculations. Victory was always just ahead, according to reports that never matched reality. Young men were drafted to fight an enemy they could not identify in a war that had no clear purpose. At home, something unprecedented happened. Americans stopped trusting. Students filled the streets, draft cards burned, cities erupted, veterans returned disillusioned. The nation turned its anger inward, and the government responded, not with listening, but with watching. Protest groups were infiltrated, Leaders were discredited. Surveillance expanded again, always framed as temporary, always justified by stability. Then the truth escaped. The Pentagon Papers revealed that leaders had lied for years, that decisions were made knowing they would fail, that lives were spent to delay embarrassment. Trust collapsed. The war ended. The systems built to manage dissent did not. By the 1970s, America had learned a refined lesson. You don't need constant terror, you need constant visibility. The intelligence agencies reorganized, oversight was discussed, reforms were promised, but technology quietly shifted the balance. Computers replaced filing cabinets, databases replaced memories, watching people became easier and cheaper. Surveillance no longer required suspicion, it required infrastructure. And infrastructure, once built, demands purpose. When the Cold War ended, Americans believed the tension had finally lifted. The enemy was gone. Democracy had won. History had chosen its side. But the habits formed during fear did not disappear. They waited. They adapted. They became invisible. And when fear returned, sudden, spectacular, unforgettable, the country did not need to invent new powers. They were already there. The language changed. No longer emergency, no longer temporary, just security. America did not become a nation that watches itself overnight. It learned slowly, carefully, across generations, that watching feels safer than trusting. And once a society accepts that idea, it does not feel like control. It feels like common sense.